My name is Margaret Walker. I'm 68 years old, a widow, and I've lived in the same quiet town of Elmswood for over 40 years. Most days, my life is simple. I tend the garden, read the paper with my morning coffee, and visit the library every Tuesday because they still let me check out as many books as I want. After Alan, my husband, passed away 6 years ago, it took me a while to get used to the silence. We were married for 39 years. He used to hum while he washed dishes, and even now, when I stand at the sink, I still half expect to hear that low, tuneless hum coming from the other room. I just got back from spending 2 months in New Jersey with my daughter Claire. She's got a new baby, and I wanted to help her settle into the chaos of it all. It was good to be there, to feel needed again, to hold that little bundle of life and remember the smell of baby powder and warm formula. But if I'm being honest, I missed home. I missed my own bed, my favorite mug, the smell of pine from the woods behind my house. There's something about being in your own space, especially when you're my age. That can't be replaced by even the sweetest of grandchildren. When I stepped off the bus back into Elmswood, I didn't expect anything to be different. Same sleepy streets, same dog barking 2 houses down, same friendly nod from Mr. Rourke at the pharmacy. I was ready to settle back into my routine. But sometimes life doesn't wait for you to unpack. Sometimes the things that need your attention are already waiting at your front door. What I discovered over the next few days shook something loose in me. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was so quiet, so hidden. You see, I always thought love meant staying silent, being the peacekeeper, helping, even when help wasn't appreciated. But then I realized my silence might have been hurting the person who needed me most. This isn't just a story about being a grandmother. It's a story about waking up, about choosing to see what I'd been avoiding for too long, and about what happened when I finally decided to act. The morning after I returned, I decided to stop by Greg's house. It had been a while since I'd seen Sophie, and after weeks of video calls and mailed coloring pages, I wanted to surprise her in person. His place was only a 10-minute walk from mine, just past the corner store and 2 blocks from the old church where Alan and I used to go Sunday mornings. As I turned onto their street, I slowed. The front lawn was a mess. The grass had grown too long, the flower beds were overrun with weeds, and a scooter lay sideways across the driveway. Greg used to keep things tidy, maybe not perfect, but he took pride in a trimmed lawn. That small change set something uneasy moving in my chest. I knocked, and Jenna opened the door. Her face registered surprise for just a moment before she pulled it into a smile. She tugged at the hem of her oversized sweatshirt and tucked her hair behind one ear, the way someone might when they weren't expecting company. I told her I'd just gotten home and wanted to say hello. She nodded and stepped aside, saying the kids would be glad to see me. Inside, the house felt chaotic. The cushions were on the floor, chip bags and empty soda cans cluttered the coffee table, and the TV was so loud it made my head throb. One of Jenna's boys, Evan, barely looked up from his phone. He mumbled something that sounded like a greeting, then went back to scrolling. Her daughter, Maddie, popped out of the kitchen chewing something and gave me a quick hug. She asked if I brought anything back from New Jersey. I smiled and said I had a few things, but left them at home. I looked around, waiting to hear Sophie's footsteps or her quiet voice. When I asked where she was, Jenna said she was upstairs, doing homework. It was Saturday morning. I said nothing, just nodded. She offered me tea, and I followed her into the kitchen. That room had changed. A shiny new coffee maker sat on the counter, along with a brand new microwave. Stainless steel, sleek. They didn't match the chipped mugs and old linoleum floor I remembered from before. I didn't say anything about that either. Jenna chatted about Claire and the baby, then added that Sophie's been quiet at school. Too quiet. She mentioned maybe taking her to a child therapist. I said maybe Sophie just needed a little more attention at home. Jenna's tone shifted. She reminded me that she had 3 kids, that Maddie had a swim meet coming up, and Evan was dealing with school pressures. She didn't say Sophie's name again after that. Neither did I. But my mind kept circling back to her absence. To the way Jenna's children moved freely around the house while Sophie stayed tucked away upstairs. There was a distance. And whether they meant it or not, that silence around Sophie felt loud. Too loud to ignore. That Saturday morning, I decided to stop by Greg's house again. I brought a little dinosaur book for Sophie and a box of chocolate-covered almonds Greg used to like. I figured it might smooth things over and give me a better chance to see her without everyone hovering around. The air was warm, the kind of quiet that makes you want to believe everything's fine. But even before I got to the front door, something didn't feel right. As I walked up the side path, I heard voices through the open kitchen window. Greg's voice was sharp, loud enough to make me flinch. He was scolding someone. Then I heard Sophie's small voice, trembling, trying to explain something about cleaning juice that Evan had spilled. Greg cut her off, said he didn't want excuses, told her to clean the kitchen. His tone didn't just sound firm, it sounded cruel. Then came the laughter, Maddie's high-pitched giggle followed by Evan's voice, teasing Sophie about crying. Greg told them to quiet down, but it wasn't real correction. Just a passing word. I froze under the window. I could see none of it, but I didn't have to. I knew what I was hearing. I knew the sound of a child trying not to cry. My chest felt tight. I walked around and knocked on the front door. Evan opened it and blinked at me like he wasn't sure I was real. He called into the house that I was there. I stepped inside and looked around. Things had been hastily picked up. It still smelled like syrup and old takeout. Greg came in drying his hands with a towel, all smiles. Said they were just cleaning up after breakfast. I told him I brought something for Sophie and asked where she was. He said she was in the kitchen helping out, that they believed in teaching responsibility early, that everyone did their part. I asked if Evan and Maddie were helping too. Greg hesitated, then mumbled something about them having school projects. I didn't respond. I walked straight to the kitchen. There she was. Sophie stood on a step stool, wearing a too-big t-shirt with wet sleeves. Her little hands held a dishcloth as she scrubbed the counter. Her shoulders were hunched. Her face was pale and focused. When she saw me, her eyes lit up and she jumped off the stool and ran to me. I bent down to hug her. She smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something else I couldn't quite name. Something like fear. I whispered that I brought her a book. She smiled and held it to her chest. Greg came into the kitchen and reminded her she hadn't finished wiping. That was when I stood up. I told him she had done enough for one day. He pushed back, said they had a system. I asked him to explain that system. Why a 6-year-old was scrubbing counters while teenagers stared at screens. Why he yelled so loud the neighbors could hear. He stiffened, said I was overreacting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. But inside, I felt something shift. Something solid. I had spent too many years brushing things aside, giving the benefit of the doubt, hoping people would come around on their own. But looking at Sophie's small hands, still damp from scrubbing, I knew this couldn't be one of those times. I had seen enough. I had heard enough. And I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. That night, I sat at my kitchen table long after the sun had gone down. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat there, looking out the window, listening to the creak of the old house settling into the quiet. My hands were still, but my thoughts weren't. I kept seeing Sophie on that step stool, her little arms scrubbing a counter like it was her job to hold the whole household together. Alan's chair sat across from me. He used to lean back in it after dinner, flipping through bills or reading reports from work. He always had a calm way of handling things. Do what's right. Maggie, even if it's hard. I used to think that meant keeping peace at any cost. But now I understood. Sometimes the right thing isn't soft or quiet. Sometimes it means saying no. I pulled out the manila folder where I kept copies of everything I'd sent Greg over the years. Mortgage payments, bank transfers, checks I'd written to help cover school supplies and birthday parties. It all added up to more than I wanted to admit. I never asked for anything back. I just wanted to be helpful, to feel needed after Alan passed. The next morning, I called Davidson. He'd been Alan's attorney for decades. I trusted him. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me kindly, said I looked well, asked about Claire and the baby. I laid out the documents on his desk. I told him I'd been covering most of Greg's mortgage for 5 years, that I wanted to stop, that I needed to know where I stood legally. He reviewed the paperwork carefully, flipping through each page with the same quiet focus he always had. Then he looked up and told me the truth. I wasn't a co-owner. I wasn't legally tied to the house. I was just making payments out of goodwill. I could stop any time. And then he paused. He told me there was something else. Greg had taken out a second loan on the house 8 months ago, a large one, without telling me. Davidson explained that because my payments had built up the equity, the bank had approved the new loan. Greg had used the money without needing my permission. That hit me hard. Not because of the money, but because of the trust. I thought of Jenna's new SUV, the vacation photos they posted from Florida, the wireless headphones Maddie wore like a badge, and all that time, Sophie was sleeping in a shared room, scrubbing tables, forgotten. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked Davidson what I needed to do. He drafted a formal letter for the bank and gave me a template to cancel my automatic transfer. I signed everything. Then I told him I wanted to revise my will. I wanted all my assets, my house, savings, investments put into a trust, one that would protect Sophie until she came of age. Davidson looked at me carefully, then nodded. He didn't ask questions. He just said we'd get it done. When I got home, I logged into my bank account and canceled the recurring payment I had set up for Greg's mortgage. I stared at the screen for a long minute before closing the laptop. There was no drama, no big moment, just the quiet sound of reclaiming something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. Control, clarity. I wasn't doing this to punish Greg. I was doing this because Sophie deserved better, because someone had to see her, and I wasn't going to wait for anyone else to do it. 3 weeks after I stopped the payments, I was trimming the hydrangeas in the front yard when I saw the sheriff's car pull up to Greg's house. 2 officers in plain clothes walked up with envelopes in hand. I didn't need to ask what it was. Foreclosure notices don't come with much ceremony. I set the shears down, wiped my hands on my gardening apron, and stood there as the weight of it all settled. The next afternoon, Greg called. His voice was thin, like it had been wrung out. He asked if we could talk. I told him to come by whenever he was ready. He showed up less than an hour later, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had run out of places to hide. He didn't say hello. He just walked into the kitchen and sat at the table like he used to when he was a boy who had scraped his knees. He said it was over. The bank was auctioning the house in 3 weeks. He said they had tried to keep up, but the second loan, the credit cards, the utilities, it all piled up. I poured him a cup of tea and let him talk. When he finally stopped, he looked at me. He asked for help. Not for the house, he said. That was gone, but just enough to cover the deposit on a small apartment. Maybe help with moving costs. I asked him where Sophie would sleep. He shrugged, said the new place had 2 bedrooms. Maddie and Sophie could share. I felt my stomach clench. I remembered the way Maddie mocked Sophie that morning by the window. I remembered Sophie's eyes when she clung to that dinosaur book. I looked Greg in the face and told him I had another idea. I said Sophie should come live with me, just for now, just until they got back on their feet. She could keep her school, her friends, her routine. Greg blinked. He wasn't expecting that. He said Jenna might not agree. I told him Jenna already had. We'd spoken, and for once, she didn't fight it. His face shifted. Shame, anger, maybe even relief. He asked if it would be permanent. I said no. A year. We'd revisit after that. I'd take care of everything: school, meals, doctor's appointments, but I wouldn't give them $1. Not for rent, not for furniture, not for car repairs or internet bills. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. He asked if this was about punishment. I said no. It was about protection. He said they didn't even have money for the deposit. I told him to sell Jenna's SUV, sell the electronics, cut the streaming services. I reminded him he had resources. He just didn't want to let go of comfort. He leaned back in the chair like I had slapped him. There was a long pause. He stared out the window like it might give him an answer. Then finally, he nodded, said, okay, but just for now, 1 year, then we'd talk. I nodded too. 1 year, that was all I needed. Enough time to give Sophie the one thing she hadn't had in that house: safety and stability, someone who saw her, really saw her. It wasn't the way I had pictured helping my family, but it was the only way left. Sophie moved in on a Wednesday afternoon with a single suitcase and her school backpack. That was all she brought. No favorite stuffed animal, no box of keepsakes, just a few clothes, some books, and a tiny crescent moon necklace she wore under her shirt. I had spent the weekend clearing out Claire's old room, wiping down the windows, and picking out soft yellow curtains that caught the morning light just right. I bought a twin bed with a floral quilt and placed a small bookshelf near the wall, already filled with picture books and a few early chapter ones I thought she might like. When she stepped into the room, Sophie stood silently in the doorway. Her eyes scanned the space, landing on the little reading lamp, the fluffy pillows, the window that looked out to the backyard. I knelt beside her and told her it was all hers now. No need to ask permission, no need to earn it, just hers. She looked up at me and gave a small nod, but her shoulders stayed tight. That first night, I made grilled cheese and tomato soup, the kind Alan used to call comfort food on cold days. She picked at the bread, barely touched the soup. After dinner, I gave her a bath with lavender bubbles and let her choose a book to read before bed. She picked the dinosaur book I gave her weeks ago. I read it slowly, pausing so she could trace the pictures with her fingers. When I tucked her in, she whispered thank you, then curled onto her side, holding that little necklace between her fingers. At 2 a.m, I heard her cry out. I rushed in and found her tangled in the sheets, whispering, "I'm sorry," over and over. Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket like she was bracing for something. I sat on the edge of the bed, placed a hand on her back, and told her she was safe now. I stayed with her until she drifted off again, her breathing slow and even. This became a pattern. For the first few nights, she'd wake up crying, sometimes calling for her dad, sometimes just curled into herself, silent. I didn't push. I just showed up. I sat beside her, rubbed her back, brought her warm milk in the morning. I made her lunch with little notes tucked inside and walked her to school with my hand gently resting on her backpack. She never let go of that necklace. But little things started to shift. One day, she asked if she could water the garden with me. Another morning, she pointed at a bird outside the window and said she liked its song. She started humming to herself while brushing her hair. And one evening, when I asked how her day was, she told me a story about a girl in her class named Abby who liked to make up silly songs. Sophie laughed when she said it. A soft, real laugh. The kind I hadn't heard in months. I didn't say anything right away. I just listened, let her words fill the room. And later that night, as I turned out her light, she looked at me and asked if we could read 2 books tomorrow. I said yes, always yes. And for the first time since she arrived, she fell asleep without a single tear. One Saturday morning, we sat on the porch sipping hot cocoa, our new weekend routine. The air was cool and quiet, and Sophie had her knees tucked up under her sweatshirt. I asked if there was anything she'd like to try after school. Sports, art, maybe science club. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. Then she said it softly, almost like she wasn't sure she was allowed to want it. She wanted to learn piano. I smiled and told her that was a beautiful idea. That afternoon, I called around town and found a retired music teacher named Mrs. Phelps who lived only a few blocks away. She had taught for over 30 years and agreed to take Sophie on for weekly lessons. On the first visit, I sat in the corner of the living room while Sophie sat at the old upright piano. She touched the keys gently at first, like they might break, but when Mrs. Phelps played a simple tune and asked her to follow, Sophie listened once and echoed it almost perfectly. By the third lesson, Mrs. Phelps called me aside and said that Sophie had something rare, a natural ear. She heard rhythm and melody in a way that most children her age didn't. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and looked over my budget. I had some savings tucked away, and the next morning, I found a couple selling a secondhand piano just outside town. It was scratched in places, a little worn, but it played beautifully. I had it delivered that Friday. When Sophie came home from school and saw it sitting in the corner of the living room, she froze. Her backpack slipped from her shoulder. She turned to me and asked if it was really for her. I nodded. She ran her fingers across the keys and sat down, her back straight, eyes wide. Then she began to play the melody from her first lesson, slowly at first, then with more confidence. Over the next few weeks, the house changed. The silence that used to sit heavy in the evenings was replaced by gentle notes, some scales, some stumbles, and then short, sweet pieces that filled every room. Sophie laughed more. She started humming while tying her shoes, tapping rhythms on the table, clapping little patterns while brushing her hair. Music wrapped itself around her like a blanket, and every note told me the same thing. She was coming back to life. Greg stopped by one afternoon to pick up some school documents for Sophie. She was at her piano lesson, so it was just the two of us in the house. I had left a folder labeled estate planning on the kitchen table. It was still open from my meeting with the attorney that morning. I didn't think twice about it. I was washing dishes when he walked in, saw the folder, and picked it up. At first, I didn't realize what he was looking at. Then I heard the change in his breathing. He flipped through the pages, face tight with confusion. He asked if I had rewritten my will. I dried my hands slowly and told him yes. Everything would go into a trust for Sophie. The house, the savings, the investments, all of it protected until she came of age. His voice turned cold. He asked what he was getting. I told him his father's watch. He stared at me, silent for a beat, then exploded. Said after everything he had done for me, I was cutting him out like he never existed. He called it betrayal. Said I had always favored Claire, that I had turned Sophie into some kind of excuse to write him off. I let him speak. Let the words pour out, bitter and loud. When he finally paused, I looked him straight in the eye. I told him this wasn't about favoritism or revenge. It was about responsibility. I reminded him of all the years I paid his mortgage without asking for a penny back, the loan he took out without telling me, the silence he kept while Sophie was mocked and overworked in his house. He called me dramatic, said I was twisting things. I shook my head. I told him he could believe whatever helped him sleep at night, but I had seen enough. I had heard enough. And I wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened just because it was uncomfortable. He tried again, said he was my son, my only boy. That blood should matter. I told him Sophie was his daughter too, and he had walked past her pain every single day. I didn't raise him to be cruel, but I also didn't raise him to ignore it when it was convenient. He clenched his fists, looked like he wanted to say more, but didn't. Instead, he slammed the folder shut and left without another word. The door closed hard behind him. I stood there for a while, listening to the quiet settle back in. I wasn't shaken. Not anymore. I didn't need his approval or understanding. I just needed peace. And for the first time in a long while, I had it. The auditorium smelled faintly of old wood and freshly printed programs. Folding chairs lined the floor, and parents shuffled in with coats draped over their arms and phones in hand. I found a seat in the front row and smoothed the hem of my skirt, trying to quiet the flutter in my chest. Sophie stood backstage with the rest of the students, peeking through the curtain with wide eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and she wore a blue dress we had picked out together. She looked small up there, but not afraid. When her name was called, she stepped out slowly, clutching her sheet music like it was a shield. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and looked out into the crowd. Her eyes found mine. I gave her the smallest nod. She placed her hands on the keys, took a breath, and began. The notes came soft at first, then grew stronger. It was a piece by Schumann, the same one she had been practicing in the living room every evening. But here, under the stage lights, it felt different, fuller, braver. Each note filled the room, spilling over the silence like sunlight through curtains. Her fingers danced, sure and steady. And when the final note landed, the room paused. Then came the applause, loud and real. She stood, bowed quickly, and hurried off stage. I met her near the exit with open arms. She leaned into me, her face flushed and glowing. On the way home, we stopped for cake, just the two of us, and sat at the kitchen table as the night settled in. She looked up and asked me something quiet. "Do you think Daddy would be proud of me?" I reached over and took her hand. I said, "I know he loves you, but being proud takes effort, and not everyone knows how to give that." She nodded slowly and went back to her cake. Later that night, as I folded the extra programs and cleared the dishes, I realized this wasn't about music. It was about her being seen, really seen, not just by me, but by a room full of people who clapped because they felt something. She didn't hide. She didn't shrink. She stood in the light and filled the space with her sound. And I sat there, front row, knowing without a doubt that this was only the beginning. This was never about revenge. It was about choosing courage when silence would have been easier, about drawing a line, not to punish, but to protect. I didn't walk away from my son because I stopped loving him. I did it because I started loving my granddaughter loudly enough to matter. If you've ever found yourself in a place where keeping the peace meant abandoning someone you love, I hope you know it's never too late to choose differently. The strongest kind of love isn't loud or flashy. It's steady. It shows up over and over again. If this story spoke to something in you, I hope you'll share it. Leave a comment if you've walked a similar road, or if you're still finding your way. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe. We tell the ones that need to be heard.